What's up? We're going to talk about feminism, the origins and history. Check this out. The KKK was formed in the 1860s, right? Right after slavery was abolished. And so was the National Woman Suffrage Association, was formed right after slavery was abolished in 1869 by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth. Katie Stanton, just a few, who were the founders of this National Woman Suffrage Association. They were bickering about achieving voting rights for women. And this just so happened come right after the slaves were freed. So we have the KKK and the National Woman Suffrage Association both forming or coming into existence. The origins were right after the slaves were freed. So it looked like two movements ties into something with the blacks being freed. We're going to see if they were angry at this freedom of blacks. The KKK and the feminist movement was created right after the abolition of slavery. The KKK, angry whites, and feminists, angry white females. All right, that's who they were. Feminist argument was, how dare you give blacks, these Negroes, rights before us? So they always had it in for black men. The feminists had many black men murdered by bogus rape claims, this is historical, all throughout the country. Did you forget it was white women, false rape claims, which led to Black Wall Street being blown up and Rosewood being burned down? Emmett Till, remember him? He was burned to ashes because of white women, false sexual claims. Feminists have a bloody history in falsely charging black men with rape, which they knew was punishable by death. And this is what you want to join? Black women, Spanish women, Asian women, Arab women, Indian women? You want to join a movement with this type of history, this type of origins? Check this out. Feminists did not always have your back when you was lynched and raped, black women. All right? When your husbands and sons was lynched and raped, where were the feminist outcry? Where was the National Woman Suffrage Association on your behalf when you were suffering from that type of atrocity and inhumane acts by the devil, Caucasians? So in order for a black man, to be killed by false accusations without any lawyer present, without any trial, in order for that to happen, the white women were clearly on a board with that. Because why didn't they speak up against that? Say, oh, we got to stop these false claims. Anyway, let's move on. Feminism began in the Western world in the late 19th century. So now we're talking about feminism. Feminism began in the Western world in the late 19th century and has gone through three waves. The first wave of feminism was oriented around the station of middle upper class. Yes, white women, and involved suffrage and political equality. Like I said, yes, it was not even, pardon me, for poor white women. It was for the elite of the white women. You know why? Because white women realized, well, I'm rich. I'm just as rich as a man. I have just as much, possessions and materials as a man, but I don't have the power of men. So It was their problem. They hated that ceiling, you know, so they wanted to remove that ceiling. So they had started these feminist movements. They had no desire, no interest in poor white women rights. Fact. Go look up feminism, the first wave. Anyway, let's move on. From 1954 all the way to 1968, that was the African American Civil Rights Movement. And it was called the 1960s Civil Rights Movement. It encompasses social movements in the United States whose goals were to end racial segregation. What was their goals? To end racial segregation and discrimination. So the goals of the Civil Rights Movement was to end racial segregation and discrimination against who? Black Americans, and to secure legal recognition and federal protection of the citizen rights enumerated in the Constitution and federal law. Alright, this article covers the phase of the movement between 1954 and 1968. So they were fighting for civil rights, the Civil Rights Act, you got the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act. 3 acts that was for black people only, because they were the only people being segregated from these things, from these rights, and they were the only people being discriminated from these rights. That's it. So now let's look up, what does a minority group mean? Because when we hear the language minority, the media use it so deceptively. When you think of minority, you automatically assume black folks. But that definition for minority or minority group is one or more observable human characteristics, including but not limited to ethnicity, race, gender, wealth, health, or sexual orientation. So why, when you hear the gays, when you hear about the gays, how come you never hear them being referred to as minorities, although they fit in that minority group? When you hear about the sick, how come you never hear about the sick being referred to as minorities? How come when you hear about the poor, you never hear about the poor being regarded as minorities? The only people in this country who is consistently regarded as minorities is black people, although it's not limited to black people. That should make you go, The term affirmative action required government employers to take affirmative action to hire without regard to race, religion, and national origin. Stop. Affirmative action said it's affirmative action to hire without regard to race, religion, and national origin. Stop. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the civil rights movement was to end racial segregation and discrimination against black Americans. So you see how white people, when they pass something, it seems like it's for you, but they just sort of include you, but it's really for everybody. Let's move on. In 1967, sex was added to the anti-discrimination list. Huh? Sex? The civil rights movement didn't fight on behalf of sex, because it was black men and black women both being discriminated against and segregated together. So why would they make it a sex issue? So what gave anybody the right to add sex to it? Oh, okay, I see what's going on here. Affirmative action is intended to promote the opportunities of defined minority groups within a society to give them equal access to that of the majority population. Stop. Stop. The civil rights movement was specifically for black people who were being segregated and discriminated against. Nobody else was getting hosed down, lynched, and it was black folks primarily. So Why is affirmative action for everybody, including black? I don't, you know. It is often instituted for government and educational settings to ensure that certain designated minority groups within a society are included in all programs. Now we're going to find out why it keeps saying minority groups. And minority groups are not just black people. Minority groups is a broad range of people who fit in those minority categories. The women's liberation movement was a loose alliance of women and feminists thinking that emerged in the United States and other developed countries during the late 1960s and persisted throughout the 1970s. You hear that? It says late 1960s. Affirmative action was what? When? The civil rights movement ended in 1968. It said 1967, sex was added to the anti-discrimination list. So it looked like the women's liberation movement that sprung up in the late 1960s has sprung up just to tie itself to affirmative action. So you got black folks being lynched, being discriminated against, being racial segregated, being burned down, churches blown up, all this, denied equal access for 14 years. 1954, 1968, it took them 13, 14 years to get some type of action. And you mean to tell me this women's movement sprung up in the late 1960s, maybe 1967, that same year of affirmative action? So they didn't suffer at all. Their movement just started, and they were already automatically tied into our 14-year-old march, our 14-year-old movement. It just don't add up. And now watch this. So now they got tagged to it. Nobody asked us. Nobody said, hey, are you guys okay with this? They just tagged them to it. Now look what happens when white people are tagged to things that were supposed to be for black people. Let's see who benefits more. According to the United States Labor Department, the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women. The Department of Labor estimated that 6 million women workers are in higher occupational classifications today than they would have ever been without affirmative action policies. You see that? So black people marched and died and was hosed down and arrested and bit by dogs for 14 years. Denied services at restaurants for 14 years. Then white people, a bunch of white women, a small group compared to 20, 30 million black people, a small group of 100 white women tagged themselves to affirmative action and then benefits more than anybody from affirmative action. Let's move on. But this was foreseen though. In 1966, many blacks in SNCC developed concerns that white activists from the North were taking over the movement. Okay? So they seen this feminist movement, this feminist movement dictating the movement, the civil rights movement, and trying to include themselves in and also control it. Watch this. In 1963, Betty Friedman published a book called The Feminine Mystique. Friedman's book struck a nerve. Within 3 years of the publication of her book, a new feminist movement was born, the likes of which had been absent since the suffrage movement. Now check this out. Don't that remind you of A Birth of a Nation? Because once the blacks were freed, Then that documentary, The Birth of a Nation, came out to inflame white people to join the KKK. Now you have the Freedmen's book, which struck a nerve in white women, and that was their birth of a nation, basically. In 1966, Freedmen and others formed an activist group called the National Organization for Women. So now we got the actual date. 1966, they formed this group called the National Organization for Women. Affirmative action they just received in 1967. So once again, black people suffered for 14 years to get some type of balance, which we know it wasn't. But these white women created a movement in 1966 and was already a part of affirmative action 1 year later. Were they getting hosed down? Were they getting denied justice? Were they getting denied service in restaurants? But they're qualified to take part in action that was for us, the people who suffered physically and emotionally. Now check this out. Now was dedicated to the full participation of women in mainstream American society. They demanded equal pay for equal work and pressured the government to support and enforce legislation that prohibited gender discrimination. When Congress debated the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in employment on account of race, conservative Congress added gender to the bill. You see? So they never asked black people. They never asked black leaders. They went to their brother. The white women went to their white brothers and said, hey, let us in on, these actions. And then they was in on the actions, and now they benefit more than anybody from the actions. Okay. Several different studies investigated the effect of affirmative action on women. Curtulis, 2012, in her review of affirmative action and the occupational advancement of minorities and women during 1973 to 2003, showed that the effect of affirmative action on advancing black, Hispanic, and white women into management, professional, and technical occupations occurred primarily during the 1970s and early 1980s. Becoming a federal contractor increased white women's share of professional occupations by 0.183 percentage points, or 7.3% on average during these 3 decades, and increased black women's share by 0.052 percentage points, or by 3.9%. So you see, white women was increased to 7.3%, and black women were increased to 3.9%. So white women doubled black women on average receiving from these federal contractor contracts. Affirmative action. Double black women. A movement that black men and women 14 years died for. White women started a movement in 1966 and didn't die, didn't suffer. 1 year later, they're benefiting from all the actions more than any black person in America. Okay? Now check this out. The decline of marriage. In 1950, the percentages of white and African women aged 15 and over who were currently married were roughly the same, 67% and 64%, respectively. By 1998, the percentage of current married women had dropped by 13% to 58%, but the drop among African American women was 44% to 36% more than 3 times larger. Your gap in marriage, black women, because of this feminist movement, was 3 times larger than that affected white women from this feminist liberated movement. So you see, this movement was clearly designated to put white people put white women in a better position, advantageous point, and to break up the black family by splitting the family, where the women were given this pseudo power that they benefit the least from, as far as them and white women. So there you go. That's the history and origins of the feminist movement. It was a movement originated right after the blacks were free from slavery. Angry white women were mad that blacks had rights and they didn't. So don't forget, black people were looked at as, basically cattle. And how can you give cattle rights over us, the white women? And then when they started that movement, it was only for rich white women. It wasn't even for the poor. So this is undeniable, irrefutable facts, proof, and evidence. There you go. We'll talk racism some more.